what extent is there a tail of any outstanding. But I know we have used the time since March in order to address that.
One point on Canada, and there may be subsequent to this, but what was Canada's approach to rolling over its EU trade agreement for the UK if there is no deal?
What, sorry, say again?
Canada, in the event of no deal, what was Canada's position?
Well, Canada was I think, the one on which there had been most delay when I was looking at it before. Switzerland, as I say, was the one that dealt with 20%, and we had dealt with Switzerland.
Were there discussions with Canada? Because didn't Canada suggest that they would not be rolling over their EU trade agreement for the UK in the event of no deal?
Well, as I say, I refer to CDL as to what the latest position is with Canada. I know when you and I debated this at a previous hearing, Canada was one of the ones that was outstanding. We had done, as I say, the leading ones such as Switzerland. As to where that is, obviously there's an interplay in terms of the temporary tariff regime, which is up to 12 months.
Forgive me, Secretary of State, but you have just told us that you have been involved in preparing for no deal. You have sought to reassure the country that things would be okay in the event of no deal. And I'm struggling to get an even basic response, clear response on this. And there are businesses in my constituency, and I've
with respect, I said the exact opposite.
One business may trade with many countries through several of these EU trade agreements. So what exactly is in place should there be no deal for businesses in your constituency, in my constituency, trading under many of these trade agreements? What will happen to those businesses?
Well, with respect, I actually say the exact opposite of that, which is that my focus has been on the negotiations, which is why CDL has been leading this in terms of trade continuity as part of his contingency planning, working with Liz Truss in terms of the DIT, and they will have the latest position. I'm very happy to write to you on that. As I say, when I was looking at it, which is quite a few months ago, we had made considerable progress with areas like Switzerland, which represented a fifth by value. We'd also put in place a whole load of other ones. Canada was one of the ones at that point on which there'd been some issues, but it will be for CDL, and I'll ask CDL to write to you with an update.
Could I ask one final question, very quick question, Chair? Thank you very much. Could I ask what the message from business has been in relation to the rolling over of EU trade agreements, and whether there's been any feedback?
Yeah, there has, which is the feedback from business is for us to get a deal.
No, on the EU trade agreements. I know you and I can both say it's to get a deal. I mean, that's sort of goes without saying that everybody would want a deal and a good deal, etc., etc. But in terms of your policy, the government's policy around transitioning trade agreements, and whether that is done in their entirety, which doesn't seem to be the government's intention from the government's own updated guidance, what has been the feedback from business?
Well, as I say, I think we have made good progress in ensuring we roll over the trade agreements in a no-deal scenario with third countries. Obviously, the EU is the most significant trade deal. The best way of doing that is through a deal. That is what I've been focused on. You raise quite properly the issue in terms of Canada specifically, and we are working closely with Canada to mitigate any impact, but I will ask CDL to give you a specific update in respect of Canada.
Okay. Thank you very much. Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Secretary of State.
Morning.
Can we just go back to the court case in which I and others were involved in Scotland and the undertakings that you outlined earlier? The Prime Minister has undertaken 3 things: to comply with his obligations under the Act, to request an extension if Parliament doesn't approve a deal or agree to a no deal by Saturday, and also not to seek to frustrate the purpose of the Act. That's correct, isn't it?
You are a more senior lawyer than I am, and the Prime Minister will have given the undertakings to which I am sure you refer.
Yeah, I'm just reading from the judgment, which I'm sure you've read, and the undertakings including not seeking to frustrate the purpose of the Act.
Indeed.
Yeah, that's correct, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. And the judge also said, and I quote, that if the Prime Minister or the government went back on the assurances given to the court, this would be destructive of one of the core principles of constitutional propriety and of the mutual trust that is the bedrock of the relationship between the court and the Crown. Do you agree with that statement?
It will. You're reading out, I assume, something from the court.
I'm asking you whether you agree with the highest court in Scotland that if the Prime Minister or the government went back on the assurances, the undertakings you've described, it would be, and I quote, destructive of one of the core principles of constitutional propriety and of the mutual trust that is the bedrock of the relationship between the court and the Crown.
I would expect government to stand by undertakings it's given by the court, and the Prime Minister has been very clear at all stages that we will abide by the law.
So you agree with that statement then?
I agree that we will always abide by the law, always abide by the ministerial code and by undertakings that have been given to the court.
So as a lawyer, you'll know what frustrating the purpose of the Act means.
I would always defer to the Attorney General to give me I am extremely out of date in my legal analysis as to precise definitions, but I think the underlying principle to which you refer, of course, will be known.
Okay, well, there have been various media reports, and one of your fellow ministers, Andrea Leadsom, has been on television saying that there was an intention to send a letter seeking an extension in terms of the Benn Act, and then send another letter saying, oh, that's not really what we want something else. I'm sure the Attorney General will have advised you that to do that would be to frustrate the purpose of the Act and therefore to breach the undertakings given to the court. That's right, isn't it?
Well, again, it's not for me to spell out what the Attorney has or has not said, but I think you know the Attorney well. You have praised his integrity in the Chamber quite properly.
I'm not asking about the Attorney General's advice. I'm asking whether you agree that for the Prime Minister to send a second letter undermining the terms of the first letter would be to frustrate the purpose of the Act. Do you agree with that?
It is, well, I don't think it is right and proper for me in an evidence session to this committee to get into detailed analysis of the law, interpretations, definitions and otherwise. What I am very clear on as a member of the government is that it's my duty to abide by the law, that we will do so, and the Prime Minister will stand by the commitments he has given to the court.
So is there a plan to send two letters?
I'm not aware of any such plan.
If no agreement is reached in the next couple of days, will the Prime Minister put to Parliament on or before Saturday the option of leaving without a deal?
Well, again, as I said at the very outset, and the Chair probed on these important matters, in terms of what is and is not put to the House, then the proper manner in which that is done is through the Leader of the House, and there'll be an opportunity for him to do so tomorrow.
According to the DEGSU website, your responsibilities include working closely with the United Kingdom's devolved administrations. Now, we know, because there's been much discussion about Northern Ireland, that there isn't a devolved administration in Northern Ireland just now, but there are devolved administrations in Edinburgh and Cardiff. Can you tell us what liaison you've had with the UK's devolved administrations about the progress of negotiations this week?
This week, I haven't spoken to Jeremy or to Mike this week. One of the ministers within DEGSU went up to Edinburgh to meet with the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government last Thursday as part of his engagement on my behalf. That was because I think from memory I was travelling in Europe that day. In fact, I was travelling over to Brussels for the meeting with Michel Barnier on the Friday. Otherwise, originally it had been in my diary for me to attend, but because of the Barnier, the meeting with Michel Barnier, another minister went on my behalf. But also attending that meeting was the Chancellor Duchy of Lancaster, again ensuring that there was cabinet engagement with the devolved administrations.
So that was a meeting last week?
That was on Thursday.
Yeah. So am I to understand that there has been no liaison by your department or indeed by the government, with either the Welsh or the Scottish administrations this week about the progress of the negotiations?
I'd have to check with the ministerial team. I've been in, as I say, I've been travelling a lot over the last couple of days as to where the engagement is. There's a lot of engagement also done at official level, and one of the things I did following actually previous session at this committee was change the guidance for officials within my own department on their engagement with the devolved administrations to increase the level of official engagement, because
I'm not really talking about official engagement, forgive me, we're short on time. I'm talking about ministerial engagement, because you see, we've seen the Democratic Unionist Party and the ERG being in and out of Downing Street this week, being kept apprised of how things are progressing. I'd like to know whether you're able to tell us whether there has been any ministerial engagement with either my colleagues in the Scottish Government or the Welsh Government about the progress of these negotiations this week, because the public can see that the DUP and the ERG are being kept closely advised. But so far as I am aware, the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government, democratically elected by the people of Scotland and Wales, are out of the loop. Now, can you, I realise you've been backwards and forwards to Luxembourg, but I think you would agree with me, it'd be quite a serious matter if the DUP and the ERG were in the loop, but the Scottish and the Welsh governments were not in the loop. So if you're not able to answer today and give me that comfort, could you possibly write a letter to the chair of the committee to confirm whether or not the Welsh and Scottish governments are in the loop?
I'm very happy to. I know that I was due to have had a call with Jeremy and Mike on Saturday that unfortunately had to be postponed. But within the last week, ministers within DEXU and the Chancellor of Duchy of Lancaster and others travelled up to Edinburgh as part of our engagement. So I think when you've got ministers actually going up to Edinburgh within the last week as part of our engagement,
but yesterday,
it is slightly...
yesterday, Secretary of State, and the day before, the DUP and the ERG were in and out of number 10 Downing Street. I'm not talking about last week. We all know things have moved quite fast this week. A bit like a yo-yo, right enough, but you're being very clear there have been important developments this week. So I'm not really interested in what happened last week. I'm not interested in the fact that a very junior minister phoned the Scottish Government at the last minute on Monday morning to say what was in the Queen's speech. What I want to know is what engagement there has been with the Scottish and Welsh governments about the progress of the negotiations this week. It is my suspicion that there has been none. And I'd like you to be able to put my mind at rest that there has been some. Now, I accept that you've been travelling backwards and forwards. You may not be able to answer that question, but it would be good if you could answer it at a later date, because I think voters in Scotland and Wales will be keen to know that their governments have been kept apprised of what's going on in terms of your department's responsibilities.
Yeah, I'm very happy to write to you with an update, but as I say, one of the things also we have been doing as part of the increased engagement with both the Scottish and Welsh Government is changing the way that officials engage in order to actually facilitate much more transparency in terms of information.
You see, it seems that the DUP and the ERG have access to the Prime Minister, but you're suggesting that really all you can give me by way of comfort is official to official contact. What I'm interested in is whether you or your department have been in contact with the democratically elected governments of Scotland and Wales, minister to minister.
I know we have within the last week, including, as I say, the Minister of State in the department travelling up to Edinburgh to engage with Scottish ministers. In terms of XO, the Scottish Government regularly attend those Cabinet Subcommittee meetings as part of our New Deal preparation. In terms of precisely what conversations in the context of the negotiations, I will ensure we get some clarity to you on that. But of course, the Scottish Government has already preempted those negotiations by saying, as I understand it, that you will vote against any deal that we bring back in any event. So obviously, whilst we're happy to engage, it seems whatever we say as part of that engagement will get the same result in terms of any vote in the House of Commons.
Well, as I say, I'd be grateful if you could write to confirm. What,
yeah, we look forward to receiving that letter.
When will the Scottish Government see the detail of the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration?
Well, that is still, as I say, under intense negotiation at the moment, and those discussions are ongoing.
Okay, right. Richard Graham, thank you.
Thank you very much. Secretary of State, I'm just looking at the agreement on the withdrawal of the UK from the EU, which is a 565-page document. And of course, in the Queen's speech, it's laid out that our top priority effectively is to implement a withdrawal agreement bill, which is the withdrawal agreement plus a new protocol on Northern Ireland. So the only part of this weighty document that is going to be changed is the protocol on Northern Ireland, as I understand it. And within the roughly 170 pages of the protocol on Northern Ireland, can you confirm to us which articles, like Article 6 on the customs territory, are really the ones that are sort of under negotiation?
I'm afraid, with respect, Mr. Graham, I can't. In that, I don't think it'd be appropriate to do so. But we are obviously having those negotiations, and I think to go through the different sections of the Northern Ireland Protocol and start a discussion now when we're at a very sensitive moment in those discussions would not be the right time. And I am sure all members of the House want the negotiators to have the space in order to work effectively.
I totally understand that. So, in a sense, the question is, if the negotiations are successfully concluded on Thursday and Friday, what sort of information would be provided to members of the House in order for them to be informed before the vote on Saturday morning? Are you, for example, anticipating that a summary of the main changes to the Northern Ireland Protocol could be published before the House sits?
Well, I think we did touch on this point before, and I'm not going to get drawn on exactly what papers will and will not be shared. Of course, in terms of any sitting, that will be an issue for the Leader of the House in terms of his statement tomorrow.
The other aspect, of course, of these negotiations is the political declaration, which you've touched on. Is there any intention to publish any changes to that before any vote on a withdrawal agreement on Saturday?
Well, again, I think it relates to your previous question. I think what we are very clear is we need to ensure that information is shared with members of the House in order for them to proceed. But the key issue is to reach an agreement, and that is what we're focused on, and that is the key challenge ahead.
Some people, of course, and particularly those who voted for the Benn Act, believe that the Benn Act has been helpful in trying to prevent no deal. Others of us believe that the risk involved in continuing to try and prevent no deal by extending our period of Article 50 and therefore not reaching a conclusion on a deal risks precisely the opposite effect, and that were this country to have to go to a general election in order to resolve the complete failure of this Parliament to determine how we leave the European Union, the next Parliament might take a very different view and might proceed direct to no deal. Do you think that that risk is a real one for those of us who wish to leave the European Union but with the best possible deal?
Sure. Well, I think in terms of the views of colleagues on the legislation in the name of the Chair, I suspect what I say will not change their view on that, in that those who supported it in the first stage will think it will have been helpful, and those who didn't will think it wasn't.
And that,
personally,
way,
as part of the negotiating team, I feel it's been extremely unhelpful in terms of negotiations, but colleagues across the House will have their own view.
Well, that, by the way, Secretary of State, is precisely the reason why some of us wish to make sure that the chairman of this committee provides evidence to the committee, because that is an important issue that needs to be fleshed out. But anyway, please.
Well, that's the matter for the committee, and I'm sure the Chair will appreciate, not for me to That's a committee matter to resolve. I think in terms of the wider point you raise, Mr. Graham, I do think that that delay leads to a worse outcome for those of us who want to ensure that the UK leaves with it in a smooth and orderly way. And that is why I think we're at such a pivotal moment now, because I think the time is right for a deal. I think the time is now for us to come together. I think it is very much in the interests of both sides to do so. I think there's a recognition on both sides that that is the best way forward. And in part for reasons we've heard from members of the committee, in order that we can then get on to the future relationship and also the very strong bilateral relationships that we have with member states. But probably above all, and I felt this very strongly when I have been in capitals and spoken to UK citizens there, I think a smooth and orderly deal enables us also to safeguard the citizens' rights part of the withdrawal agreement, which is an issue I know many people feel extremely strongly, both EU citizens in the UK, who we hugely value. We're very grateful they've chosen to make their lives in the UK, and the withdrawal agreement, I think, will, even though we've guaranteed their rights, I think the withdrawal agreement will send a very positive message to them, but also for our UK nationals across Europe.
Yeah, I think there's no question that for many of us, the importance of resolving the issues for citizens is a crucial goal. Can I ask Secretary of State, were you surprised by the European Parliament's President David Sassoli's comments after meeting the Prime Minister on the 8th of October? He said specifically to reporters afterwards that if the UK government's latest proposals are all that is on offer, then the UK Prime Minister doesn't want an agreement. What did you make of that?
Well, I think there is recognition across Europe that the Prime Minister wants a deal. I think that has been reflected in the very constructive tone taken by EU leaders who have themselves said they can see a pathway to a deal, and that they are keen to see the UK leave in a smooth and orderly way. Yeah. And I think there's a very constructive spirit both on the EU side and on the UK side, and we're very keen to move forward on that basis.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Jeremy Lefroy.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd just like to turn first of all to the political declaration. I was with a number of trade union representatives yesterday from a UK business which accounts for, by some estimates, 2% of the entire GDP of the country. And they clearly were absolutely really concerned about the possibility of no deal. But they were also concerned about what might be in this political declaration as against the former Prime Minister's political declaration, which they have been largely content with, which is one reason why I supported it and you supported it. What, in general terms, could I say to such trade union representatives that might be comforting about the political declaration and the future process of negotiations once, as I very much hope, we achieve a withdrawal agreement?
Yeah, no, I think you reflect a very serious concern. It's one they've raised with me when I met with Francis O'Grady or Len McCluskey in the past. They were very clear on the importance of these issues. We discussed it also as part of the talks between the previous government and the Labour front bench at that time. I think if you look at the Queen's speech, Mr Lefroy, you will see a government committed to very high standards in ways that I've previously referenced. The UK has always been a world leader in many of its standards, and if one looks at the post-Brexit economy the UK is seeking to achieve, it is one of high productivity, high skill. The fact that when the UK leaves the EU, the top 10 universities in Europe, none of them will be within the EU. 8 will be in the UK, 2 will be in Switzerland. And the sort of economy that we're seeking to build is one of good regulatory standards. But it comes to the point that Mr. McFadden raised, which is what matters is the outcome, rather than saying one has to necessarily be lockstep in approach on regulation. So that's part of a discussion to be had. Clearly, level playing field is shaped by the future relationship, and that is part of that discussion that will be had in due course.
You've frequently referred to best-in-class free trade deal. By my calculation, if we have an agreement and leave with an agreement at the end of this month or shortly thereafter, there will be between 12 and 14 months until the end of 2020, which is the end of the initial transition period, to negotiate such a thing. Do you see the possibility of that happening? I know you're likely to say we are already in conformity in so many areas, but given the complexity and given the need to get something in excess of 30 different parliaments to agree to such a free trade deal, do you think that that is possible?
I think there's a separate question around ratification, but in terms of the wider points around whether the future agreement can be done within what is now a slightly reduced implementation period, I do. And I think first and foremost because, as you reference, we start from a position of regulatory alignment. And if you look at the traditional trade deals, a huge amount of the front-end time is taken in terms of understanding the respective positions in terms of the different economies. And so we actually start from a very advantageous position. There's also, one can get into, there's much bigger debate around this, but also just to give just one example, just logistically, teams can move much quicker because geographically, the distances, if you're flying from North America and you're bringing teams over, usually you work on 6-week cycles, whereas actually in these trade talks we'll be able to move it much quicker, partly because of geography and partly because of where we start from. So I think there are opportunities there. Another reason why we can move more quickly is because we do have a framework through the political declaration, which is why the political declaration I think is important, albeit I respect the fact some colleagues feel otherwise, but I do think the political declaration is important in terms of setting that framework. So I do believe we can do that within the timescale, and that will be absolutely the government's commitment.
And do you think those negotiations could give rise to a number of agreements, and I'm not just talking about a trade agreement, a security agreement, perhaps 3 or 4, but even within trade, a number of agreements whereby perhaps the easier areas are dealt with very quickly, so that the whole package is not complicated by having some rather difficult areas which may apply to perhaps a fairly small part of the economy holding up matters?
Well, I think if I look at the level of debate which is still ongoing around the sequencing of the first phase and whether simply dealing with the winding down arrangements separate from the future trade agreement has contributed to some of the difficulties the previous Prime Minister had in respect of the backstop, then I think you forgive me for not at this point getting into a big debate on how we will structure that. But within your question, inherently, there will be certain things that sit outside, not least on the security side, which doesn't sit within the norm. So there will be some discussions alongside where there is common interests, separate to what is normally within the bounds of a standard free trade agreement.
And do you expect within the withdrawal agreement the condition or the opportunity to have an extension of a withdrawal of an implementation period, if necessary, to conclude the negotiations will remain?
The Prime Minister's position on this is very clear, which is that we are committed to concluding that by the December 2020 deadline.
So you are, and he is convinced that it can be done by then?
Yes, we are.
And that includes all aspects, including security?
We're committed to that timetable and to moving at pace with colleagues in Europe to deliver on it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sammy Wilson.
Can I take you back to where we were at the very start on the whole issue of the consent of the Northern Ireland Assembly? The reason that you gave, though I'm sure it wasn't an extensive, the full range of reasons, but one of the reasons you gave was that if the deal was to get through Parliament, it would require support of the DUP, and we've made it clear that consent is an important issue. But is the real issue here not the Belfast Agreement? This committee has been almost hysterical in its defence of the Belfast Agreement. But given that this is a controversial issue, that it will lead to a change in the powers of the Northern Ireland Assembly, and it therefore falls under the terms of the Belfast Agreement, where there has to be cross-community consent for any change of that nature, especially if there's to be giving over of regulatory powers to the EU on a limited range of issues. So, can we avoid the issue of the consent of the Assembly without tearing up that very important part of the Belfast Agreement? And that's not just against the spirit of the agreement, but it's explicitly against the terms of the agreement.
Well, Mr Wilson, what I would do is refer back to the letter that the Prime Minister set out on the 19th of August, when, in setting out to President Tusk his reasons for seeking changes to the backstop. Central to that was his third point, which said that it was increasingly clear that the backstop risks weakening the delicate balance embodied in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, which speaks to the point that you raise. Within that, he then went on to add in his letter of the 2nd of October on his fourth point, which was that the regulatory zone that he was proposing must depend on the consent of those affected. And again, that speaks to the point. Now, as you will, I'm sure, be aware, we are in ongoing negotiations in respect of this agreement, and you wouldn't expect me, I'm sure, to get into the detail of that in a forum such as this. But I think the Prime Minister communicated through his letter on the 19th of August and on the 2nd of October his recognition that safeguarding the Belfast Good Friday Agreement was central to the proposals that the government was putting forward, and that any proposal around a regulatory zone needed to be linked to the principle of consent.
And I wouldn't expect you to get into the details of the negotiations, but what I would like to hear from you is a confirmation that the terms which are set out in the Belfast Agreement for consent for a controversial issue or an issue which requires a change in the powers of the Assembly or requires legislation would be the method by which this consent would be sought, not, as the Irish government has said, simply by a majority vote, but by a cross-community vote, which is essentially a part of the terms of the Belfast Agreement.
Well, I think the Prime Minister has, at all stages, including in the letter to which I referred, Mr Wilson, underscored that our proposals are centred on our commitment to solutions that are compatible with the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and he set that out in his letter. Now, it is then an issue for the negotiating teams in terms of how the proposal put forward by the Prime Minister is then taken forward, but he has at all stages underscored his commitment to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement.
No, but with respect, Minister, it's not an issue for the negotiating teams to decide how that's taken forward, not if it is explicit in what we are told time and time again in this committee is an internationally binding agreement, which very clearly, in fact, in very, very explicit and detailed terms, sets out how cross-community support has to be measured in the Assembly. So all I really want to hear from you today is that the terms of the Belfast Agreement, which everybody seems to be wanting to defend, will be the terms on which consent for opting into arrangements which diminish the powers of the Northern Ireland Assembly, which will treat Northern Ireland differently to a certain extent than the rest of the United Kingdom, that consent will be sought on the basis of the agreement.
Well, as I've underscored, and I think the best reference back is to what the Prime Minister himself wrote, and what the Prime Minister himself wrote was of our commitment to find solutions which are compatible with the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And the Prime Minister has been very consistent on that. And I think that is part of what was set out on the 2nd October, and that very much frames the approach that he takes.
And having served in Northern Ireland Assembly, I know that when it came to decisions of the executive, that there had to be agreement by both the main majority of unionists and nationalists for any legislation to go forward, and then there had to be a vote in the Assembly, which included the vote and the support of unionists and nationalists before, even if a majority of people voted in favour of something, if there wasn't a majority of unionists and nationalists, it could go through. And I think it's important that that is understood as the mechanism. Can I take you to the second issue? And I know that you don't want to talk about the details of negotiations, but one thing which is quite apparent, because the Irish government has been leaking it very extensively, is that one of the sticking points is whether or not there has to be some customs element to any agreement. Yesterday we had evidence given to us by Dr. Verney, who indicated that the kinds of solutions that were being sought here, for example, goods moving into Northern Ireland until their final destination was known, European duties would be imposed on them. That could lead to additional costs for Northern Ireland businesses of up to £500 million. In the event, plus all the administrative checks that would be required to trace those goods and give assurances that didn't actually go into the European Union or whatever, I hope that, first of all, the government is not contemplating that, but secondly, what assessment has the government made of any such arrangements which would require tariffs, albeit to be paid and then rebated to the businesses in Northern Ireland? What assessment have they made of the impact that that would have, first of all, on red tape, and secondly, on costs to Northern Ireland businesses?
Well, I mean, any impact flows from the arrangements that are put in place, and obviously those arrangements are determined and shaped by, firstly, the negotiation that is very much ongoing, and secondly, by whether the House then approves that moving forward. As you say, Mr Wilson, one of the things the Prime Minister has been very keen to do is to understand the various interests and the concerns that people have. That's why he has been engaging widely as part of that process. And these are issues that obviously are subject to live discussions at the moment, and it wouldn't be appropriate to get into today.
Could you confirm that if Northern Ireland, because one of the suggestions being made is that there are additional costs that Northern Ireland businesses can be compensated for those costs, if we sign up to abiding by some EU regulations, that then state aid rules would apply and that support could not be given to businesses which were caught with those additional costs?
Well, again, we get into sort of areas of quite complexity, but the wider point and part of the package, Mr Wilson, that the Prime Minister has set out in terms of the New Deal for Northern Ireland is a recognition of a wider point, and he spoke specifically on this in his party conference speech, where he talked about his desire to level up the United Kingdom as a whole, and part of the proposal within what he set out to the Commission in terms of a new deal for Northern Ireland was a recognition that as part of that levelling up agenda, there are areas within Northern Ireland, as there are elsewhere in the United Kingdom, where there is a need to level up, and that is also part of the wider package that's under consideration.
But you accept that if additional costs were imposed as a result either of different administrative arrangements or different customs arrangements, that would actually make that levelling up much more difficult than it is at present, especially if EU state aid rules were to apply to Northern Ireland?
These things need to be looked at in the round, and as I say, part of the reason within the package to have the commitment on a new deal is a recognition, as the Prime Minister set out in his party conference speech, of the need to level up those. The wider message that certainly I take from engagement, and also the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland takes from his engagement, is again the desire to ensure we leave in a smooth and orderly way, because that is the way of best addressing the concerns that have been raised.
And the last question then, just in terms of what has been proposed by at least what they have said in public, what the Irish government and the EU said in public about the different arrangements for Northern Ireland, what assessments has the government made of the kind of checks that we required from GB to Northern Ireland to facilitate, if those demands of the EU and the Irish were to be acceded to facilitate the checks on goods between Northern Ireland, or between GB and Northern Ireland?
Well, I think the absolute priority that we have is to ensure that Northern Ireland will be fully part of the UK customs territory. In terms of the negotiations and how that commitment is then taken forward, obviously one has to have clarity on what those arrangements are before one can start to assess and do any impact assessments or address what mitigations are required. So I think we need to give the negotiators space. I'm sure you would recognise that. These issues will come back to the House for consideration, but we need to ensure that the negotiators are able to proceed.
And by Saturday, will we have clarity on exactly the kind of infrastructure that would have to be put in place if such an agreement were reached, so that people voting in this will be voting on it with total knowledge of the kind of impediments that may be placed on trade between GB and Northern Ireland? Well,
I think the first order of business is to see whether we can secure a deal with the EU. That is what Mr Wilson were absolutely focused on with the government on delivering. Once we have that clarity, then clearly there will be an urgent need to bring that matter back to the House and to get into these very important issues that you raise.
Okay. Just to, on that last point that Samuel Wilson's raised, is it the government's policy that it would not accept customs checks in the Irish Sea? The government's policy, I'm not asking what's going on in the negotiations, but is it the government's policy that it is opposed to customs checks in the Irish Sea?
Well, again, what we've said throughout is it is essential that the Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom customs territory. Because that is a sort of fundamental point in terms of UK sovereignty and UK control of its trade policy. Again, once we start to get into the details operationally then as to some of the arrangements, that is an issue that is part of the negotiations. And I think colleagues would understand, given the sensitivity of the point at which we reach, that it is better that we come back to the House and discuss these issues once there is further clarity.
Okay, Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Chair, and many thanks for your patience, Secretary of State. I think we've actually overrun our time now, but if I could just test your patience a little further. Just building on what my colleague, Mr McFadden, was asking about the political declaration on the future relationship, and specifically on this issue of regulatory divergence. You received a letter from 5 key manufacturing industries, alongside Mr Gove, I believe, aerospace, automotive, chemicals, food and drink and pharmaceuticals. All of those industries are responsible for employing thousands and thousands of people in our constituencies, and I have no doubt in yours as well. And they raised very serious concerns about regulatory divergence. They talked about the damage which would be done by the current approach on regulatory divergence. They said pan-European regulatory alignment has been a success in our industry, supporting continued creation and retention of highly skilled manufacturing jobs in the UK. It is important this regulatory alignment should continue after Brexit as a critical element of the UK's future relationship with the EU. Do you intend to respond to that letter? And if so, could you give us a sense of what we will be saying in the response?
Well, I think that letter, which I very much recall, in part because of the seniority of those that sent it, is part of a very extensive amount of engagement we have been doing with the business community and others throughout this process. And I'm sure we will respond. Partly of it will be shaped by the negotiations that are ongoing in terms of how we move forward. But the wider point is that the best way of addressing the concerns, and I know you've spoken very eloquently about this in the Chamber yourself, is the implementation period gives business confidence through a deal moving forward. Now, in terms of the wider political declaration and the time frame of that is part of the negotiations that we are having. But the key issue from a UK point of view is we have world-leading standards. There is no intention to have some sort of race to the bottom deregulatory approach for reasons that I've already set out. And if one looks at the Queen's speech, you see from the Prime Minister a very strong commitment to having high standards.
But clearly, this change in policy from the government, dropping level playing field, is about, I think what Mr. McKinley was referring to earlier, about being prepared to do deals with other bits of the world. The concern that these absolutely key manufacturing industries is raising is that by engaging in that strategy, you will by definition be opening the risk, in the Europeans' eyes, of social dumping, environmental dumping, and creating what Angela Merkel said in her speech in Paris, a Singapore on Thames, right on the other side of the channel. And surely you would agree that the EU will then be inevitably bound to raise non-tariff barriers to ensure that it's protecting its market and its standards. But so you've said that the outcome is shaped by the inputs, but if the inputs are bound to lead to a minimization of access for these key products and these key industries into that key market on the other side of the channel, you surely recognise that that could potentially do serious damage to the British manufacturing industry.
Yeah, I think, Mr. Gill, there's probably more common ground in our positions than perhaps the debate might suggest, in that, if I'm understanding your question correctly, you're alluding to the fact that there is an interplay between market access and what commitments are made. And I absolutely recognise that. It'd be, when I spoke about legitimate EU equities, obviously one of the issues they will have, which is on the one hand, they want access themselves to the UK market. It is an important market. But in terms of the size of the EU market, there is always, in any trade deal, and I reference even within the CETA trade deal, there is language on this point around the trade-off in a trade deal between what commitments are given and what market access you undertake. And that's why I reference back to a slide which I'm sure you're very familiar with, the famous escalator slide, where the Commission themselves made a similar point. So I don't think, if I may say, that you and I, if I'm understanding correctly, are disagreeing, that there is this interplay, and part of the negotiation will be to have discussions of this very order.
But if I could just bring it back also to the sort of question of the parliamentary arithmetic to which Mr. Ginogly referred, you must surely see and understand that when Labour members of Parliament see a letter like that from aerospace, automotive, chemicals, food and drink and pharma, major employers in our constituencies, it rings very large alarm bells with us. And I just don't really understand why the government chose to put that line in that Mr. McFadden referred to earlier, explicitly saying there is no need for the extensive level playing field arrangements envisaged in the previous protocol, because that's clearly what triggered this letter and these concerns.
Yeah.
So can you, given the parliamentary arithmetic, given the serious concerns raised in this letter, can you please explain what was the thinking that underpinned putting that sentence in?
Well, I think, so the thinking is because the government was able to be more explicit than the previous government in terms of the future relationship. In fact, one of the criticisms I received on behalf of the previous government was that the political declaration was too wide in scope. And you'll be familiar in terms of your own conversations with EU interlocutors that they previously questioned whether the UK had been specific enough in terms of what future relationship it was seeking, and that is a question that the Prime Minister has answered, and therefore the line to which you referred is a reflection of that. But moving forward, I'm very aware of the parliamentary arithmetic. I'm very happy to reach out and to have further conversations away from the committee with colleagues on all sides of the House on these issues. Of course, in terms of the third meaningful vote, which failed to carry the House, that was separate to many of these issues, but at the same time I do recognise these are important issues for members across the House, and I'm very happy to have further discussions with them as part of that.
One final point. I mean, on the political declaration, I mean, I accept that it's going to be a movable feast to some extent during the transition period, and the government will need to agree a negotiating mandate with the European Union, and you move forward through the various stages. But the reality is, when we go through those division lobbies to vote, we're voting on the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration. And the political declaration is a vitally important and politically binding statement of intent, because whilst I would love to dream that we will have Labour governments for the next 100 years, the chances of that, I'm sure everyone would agree, are fairly slim. So we're voting in light of the possibility that there may not be a Labour government negotiating the turning the political declaration into an international treaty which will define the future relationship between the European Union and the United Kingdom for generations to come, potentially. So when we go through those division lobbies, we are doing so on the basis of an understanding that this is a binding political declaration which actually transcends party politics. Would you agree that that's a fair interpretation?
So I would very much agree, Mr. Kinnett, that the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration are part of a package, where, if I may say, I'd slightly disagree, is that previously a huge amount of work was done to try and address concerns around across the House. And yet even on the third meaningful vote, when it was purely on the withdrawal agreement and not linked to the political declaration, then the arguments to which you've just referred at that time were not persuasive to many colleagues across the House. So I think the key issue is very happy to have further conversations with members on all sides, but clearly it will be shaped by the future negotiation, and in order for us to get into that, we need to be able to pass the withdrawal agreement.
One very final point. I see the point that you're making around having no political declaration whatsoever, which in effect that was the third meaningful vote, was just the withdrawal agreement and no political declaration. But I mean, in a sense, that it makes you even more of a hostage to fortune, because you have no statement of intent whatsoever then, but you do have lines like this in the letter that was sent saying we're going to drop all the level playing field arrangements. So I would gently suggest that it is better, I think, for the government to come forward with a clear statement of what it intends in terms of the future relationship, because then we at least know what we're doing and people know what they're voting for or against in that circumstance.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Well, Secretary of State, that is it. Can I just say, for the record from the Chair, that no member of this committee is biased. We just happen to have different views and everyone is entitled to have them, including yourself. We're very grateful to you for coming this morning. Yeah. And if I can end by saying, may there be light at the end of everyone's tunnel. Yes. Order, order.
Thank you very much.
Portcullis House, the Boothroyd Room. Portcullis House, the Boothroyd Room.